Welcome to the Growth in Life virtual mentoring series. Today's installment is on the art of conversation, listening, and being heard. Our speakers today are Vice President of Operations Amanda.
Hello.
Our Director of Content Rachel.
Hi there.
And myself, Lynn, the co-founder of Petite to Queen. So let's dive right in. The importance of listening is always evident in my work, my life, and the value of my relationships. In fact, over the years, I've learned to become a better listener, and I'm still working on it. In my case, I can become too immersed in what's going on at work, especially at work, and what I'm trying to juggle at home. And balancing, work and life can directly impact, my ability to focus, my attention, and truly listen. So, I have a story. So last year, after we were completing our book and launching Petite to Queen, both my husband and father were very ill, and it was an avalanche. And it was almost impossible for me to truly hear outside of this maelstrom. And it definitely affected how I was listening. So Rachel and Amanda, have you experienced episodes of this type of tunnel vision?
Well, actually, for me, I haven't, because I actually deal with stress kind of the opposite from you. When I'm stressed, I sort of can't focus on anything, right? So that's not how I process stress, but I do understand what you mean, Lynn.
Yeah, sometimes when I'm actively stressed about things at work, I can have a hard time paying attention to what others are saying. And I've noticed this in myself and have consciously tried to focus on them. I just have to forget about the stress, even if it's just for a few minutes.
Yeah, see, going through difficult times is a part of life, and we all do react and respond differently. But, to me, this is when your genuine ability to hear and connect will support you. Your family, your friends, your coworkers, all your relations and your relationships, they're going to rally around you. And this is it's your turn to be nurtured and cared for and to help you through the challenge. And it's the strength of your relationships. And they're based on listening and sharing feelings and concerns and providing support, reciprocal support, that you're there for them. So when we think about being there, it's all about hearing the other person, letting them work through their thoughts by talking about them. And I guess, when I look at this in a bigger picture, it's karma or the rule of three. When you have listened and you've shared and you've been there for others, they're there for you. So Amanda and Rachel, how do you see the value of relationships helping you listen? Amanda?
Well, in my mind, I think that if you truly value your relationship with another person, you must and will listen to them. Not just passively, but actively listening. Listening is how you discover more about them. If you don't listen well, that indicates that you don't place much value on what they think or do.
Yeah, I agree with you, Amanda. I think listening is probably one of the most important skills to develop in your life in order to be building strong relationships. Because whether you mean or not, or whether you mean it or not, when you're not listening, it demonstrates or indicates that you don't care about the other person. And I know that sometimes that's not true and you're just in your own head, but it does communicate that, and you need to be careful.
Yeah, I agree. And I was going to say, in our society, for the last century or so especially, we've placed high value on extroversion and talking, and that has kind of left listening and introversion more by the wayside. And despite that, listening is far more important than it may seem. If you don't listen, you won't understand the world and the people around you. Listen and you will learn what other people think, what they dream about or worry about, and why they feel that way. Listen and you will hear new ideas and voices. They may be at odds with what you think or what the loudest perspectives are, but you will discover something different and unique. In order to develop true relationships, you need to listen to your partner, friend, relative, or colleague. And don't just listen because it's polite to do so. Listen so you can understand them. That's how you develop empathy and awareness. Listening is also vital if you want to hold a good conversation. No one wants to be on the receiving end of a long monologue or a one-sided conversation. Don't dominate discussions. It's not fair to the other person. Talking too much indicates that you don't care what the other person thinks. You are only thinking about what you think and what you say. Sometimes you need to just stop and let the other person talk. It'll lead to a more balanced conversation in which you both share. And if you're both listening and you're both talking, you'll have a positive experience. Rachel, what would you like to add about why listening is so important?
Well, I mean, I think listening is important for a very simple reason. It's that when you listen, you're able to actually get to know the person that you're talking to find things in common, to build connections and understand them as a human being, because we all want to not just be heard, but to be understood. But you need to be heard before you can be understood, right? So for me, I'm not an especially good listener, right? So I'm not an especially good listener. In fact, I would sort of consider myself to be a bad listener. I do try. I try very hard to be a good listener, but I find that I'm often failing. But the thing is, I've already got that first step that you see on the slide there, self-awareness. Of course, the first step to solving a problem is knowing that you have one. And the good news is that I know that I'm not the best listener. So your next step there would be to ask yourself why you're bad at listening. And it's going to vary from person to person. I know Lynn was talking about how she gets too focused on the things that are going on in her life. For me, it's a focus problem too. In my situation, it's that I'm too focused on how I'm going to respond to that person. Like, I'm listening to what they're saying, but I'm more interested in how I'm going to respond and what I'm going to say to make that connection, right? And it comes from a good place, I think. I'm not doing it out of malice, or I don't think it's out of narcissism. It comes from a place of me wanting to connect and wanting to say something that's going to bring us closer together. But the fact that I'm so focused on what I'm going to say means I'm not actually focusing on what they're saying, which is preventing me from getting to know someone. But there are also other situations. Sometimes it's because I get tired. I'm a bit of an introvert, and so when I'm socializing for a long period of time, I run out of steam. And when that happens, I check out. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I was doing what I consider like a marathon of socializing. I was at a workshop and I had to socialize with people for 10.5 hours. And when I was about 8 hours in, I could feel myself just like checking out and not listening anymore. So at that point, I sort of stepped away, had some food, and was able to re-engage later on. So always consider what might prevent you from being a good listener. Amanda and Lynn, but Amanda first, what keeps you from being a great listener, if anything?
Well, Rachel, like you, my introversion can sometimes cause me to check out after a while. I just get tired of socializing. Sometimes, when I have too much on my mind, I accidentally space out while someone is talking. My mind wanders, and once I notice, I try to consciously focus back in again.
Yeah. What about you, Lynn?
Well, I definitely think it's because I'm either distracted, I'm working on something, I could be interrupted. And, the bottom line is I don't stop doing whatever it is I'm doing, and make that eye contact and then focus on the other person. And so those are really the cases of when I'm being a bad listener.
See, it's all about focus but it depends on what you're focusing on. So finally, you need to think about how you can improve. So for me, as I've already said, I know what the problem is. I know why I'm not a great listener. And I know that I need to focus on what's being said rather than what I'm going to say in response. I can think of a response when they're done talking. And if that means that there's a pause in between them being done talking and me beginning my next line, so to speak, my response, that's okay. Pauses are okay to have in a conversation. And in cases when I might check out because I'm tired of socializing, that's fine too. I just need to be honest about the fact that I'm socially exhausted, that I'm checking out. because I'm tired and not because I don't care. In that situation, I can just let them know, like, hey, I'm a little tired. I don't know that I can have this conversation any longer. Can we please pick this up another time? Because I am interested in what you have to say. I'm just too tired right now. So that's how you might improve being a bad listener. Lynn, what do you have to add about being a bad listener or improving on that?
Well, definitely shut down the distractions. Stop multitasking, trying to do 6 different things at the same time, and making that eye contact so you have that direct connection, so you can, if you see them, you can be aware of their facial expressions, their body language, their tone of voice, because your attention is focused. And if it is a case where I'm in the middle of doing something or I've been interrupted, it's really simple for me to say, I want to give you my full attention, just sort of what you're saying, Rachel, but I need X number of minutes to finish this task. So I need 10 minutes to finish what I'm doing. I need whatever it is, and then just take care of and do it, and then you can stop and refocus so that you can listen, because that to your point, that's so important in building a relationship and maintaining that relationship and really demonstrating your care. So Amanda, what do you think?
Well, in general, I like to think I'm a pretty good listener, but there are certainly times when I slip up. I think we all have moments of poor listening, some more than others, but what matters is being aware of the problem, like Rachel said, and taking steps to fix it. And this segues perfectly into how you can become a better listener. We know why listening is important, and we know how to watch out in case we're bad at it. But how do you become a good listener? How do you develop this underappreciated skill? It's been said that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We should listen more than we talk. So the first step in learning to listen better is to actually listen. Stop talking. Lynn and Rachel, what do you think about the concept of having 2 ears and 1 mouth? How does that impact how much we talk and listen?
Well, I guess I could pitch in here. So I think it's about being reciprocal, taking turns, and showing that genuine interest and care to the other person, demonstrating it actively by listening to what they have to share. Rachel, what do you think?
Well, I mean, we're going to be getting into proportions a little later on, but it is the idea that you shouldn't be dominating a conversation, that you shouldn't be monologuing to other people. I think the phrase also tells us that in some cases, in a lot of cases, it's more important to listen to what's being said than to speak yourself, because by listening, that's how you learn the most, right?
Yes, very good points. When you're listening to another person talk, don't spend time planning out what you'll say next or how you'll respond. Exercise genuine interest in what the other person is saying. You need to focus on what they're saying. One way to ensure you focus is to minimize distractions. Don't hold 2 conversations at once. If you're on the phone with your sister, don't be texting your friend at the same time. And don't multitask. You shouldn't read or scroll through your social media. Don't work on a project, no matter how menial it is. If you're doing these other things, you're not listening. You're passing time while you wait for your turn to speak. It's rude, and it shows that you either don't care about what they're saying or you're too busy to talk to them right now. Give the other speaker your undivided attention. Lynn and Rachel, how do you make sure you're focusing on the other person and minimizing distractions? Rachel, what would you say?
Well, sorry. I'm admittedly kind of bad at this. When I'm having conversations, I do try to keep my phone out of sight, like maybe in my pocket or somewhere. There is something to be said about this concept of optimal levels of arousal, which refers to your brain having the correct amount of stimulus going to be able to focus best on everything. That's why a lot of people will often play games when watching games on their phone when watching movies, or maybe need to pace when they're being told something. But generally speaking, a genuine deep conversation should really be taking up all your concentration, so you should have your optimal level of arousal met in that case. Lynn, what would you say?
Well, I gave an example just previously, and I'm just going to reiterate that, make eye contact. If I'm on the phone with someone, so I'm not able to make eye contact, I picture the person in my mind's eye, and that really, really does help me focus and listen.
That's a good tip. I never thought of that. Another major tip that I have is don't interrupt. When someone's talking, let them finish. If you have something to say or you want to respond, hold that thought until they're done. And don't derail the conversation away from whatever it is that they were talking about to something else of your choosing. That can be perceived as inconsiderate. If you do need to interrupt, apologize for doing so and be brief. This shouldn't happen too often, but it will likely come up sometimes. We're only human. So, Lynn, what are your other tips for good listening?
I think it comes down to having genuine interest and curiosity so that you can truly, put yourself that you want to hear and to receive what the other individual is sharing. And that is going to make a big difference, even if it's someone you don't know well, or they're talking about a topic that really isn't of interest to you. There are other things that, so I have this example that my mother is really into genealogy. She talks about it all the time. And honestly, I just don't care. But I care about my mother. And so I listen to her and talk about this, and I will find questions that I can ask to keep the conversation going. But it's really about letting her share what she's discovered this week in her searches. And, she is so interested in this topic. So I want to encourage her and be there to, sort of acknowledge that and let her share with me. So that's something that really to keep in mind. And it doesn't have to be a close personal relationship. This is the same thing if you're at work and someone's talking about, maybe they love bowling. You've never bowled in your life and you're not interested in learning how to bowl. But, there's a lot of things that you can still pick up in the conversation, and there's other aspects, maybe the social aspect or the friends that they're meeting or the coworkers who go out with them. So there's things that you can be genuinely interested in when they're talking about bowling, right? So that would be my recommendation. So Rachel, what about you?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. So you were talking about, she's grandma to me. Grandma does talk a lot about this genealogy situation, and I, like you, Lynn, don't really care that much. But as you said, I care about grandma, and that's the thing. Listening isn't really about you; it's about the other person. It can be really difficult to look beyond ourselves and think and get outside of the idea like, oh my God, I don't care. And it's really about doing the best you can because the resulting connection is worth it. Like, right? So when grandma drones on about this genealogy thing, it doesn't matter that I'm not interested in the actual subject. What matters is that I'm really happy that she's got a project that she's working on, right? I like seeing her so excited about things. And when I listen and when I help and try to participate even, she gets really happy about that. And the resulting connection is worth the hours of learning about genealogy. But of course, sometimes someone needs a little nudging on to do their conversation, right? Their side of the conversation. So a lot of it comes down to knowing the right questions. Part of being listening or being on the listening side of a conversation is about giving the other person permission and encouragement to keep speaking by asking follow-up questions. So in this case, grandma is not one of those people, but a lot of people do need a little bit of encouragement. So Amanda, you understand how difficult it can be to start a conversation with someone new, right? How do you find the right questions to be asking?
Absolutely. I struggle with this and so-called small talk a lot. Depending on where or how I'm meeting someone, I'll ask them about things related to that. If you're at a networking event, ask them what they do for a living. If you're at a class, ask them how they got into that subject. And then you let the conversation flow from there. That's usually what works for me. But again, this is something that I'm still learning and evolving. Lynn, what about you?
Well, absolutely. It depends on the circumstances always. And for a networking event, my question would be, what brought you here today? Or what do you hope to to gain from the event today? Things like that that really can draw people out. If it's just a one-on-one, it's like, instead of saying, how is your day, when you're talking with your family, you can say, what was what was the triumph that you had today? Or what was the challenge that you faced and conquered today? Or, it's like, where do you see yourself tomorrow? And what are your plans to to address that challenge, or that, or further that triumph, if you're continuing the conversation. So there's so many different ways that you can do that, and really having a few of those, sort of in your hip pocket, so that you can ask them, is really important. And, with general circumstances, so that you can really, instead of just saying, hey, how are you doing today, it really elicits a more intensive response.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Lynn. Because, of course, when you're getting to know someone, asking open-ended questions allows them to talk about themselves, right? You can ask what they like to do, what their interests are. Typical what do you do questions are fine, but some of the questions that Lynn was suggesting are a lot better, right? Throw in some questions that won't get canned answers. They're easier to respond to, or to get a real connection out of. So instead of saying, what do you do? Just asking something simple like, what brought you here? Or what's the best thing that happened to you this morning? It's unexpected, and you're more likely to come up with a big, interesting answer. But of course, if you're sort of shy, or you don't want to just come off as being completely weird, it's fine to start out with a question of something like, what do you do? And then get into those more interesting questions later on. But of course, the idea is always to be finding common ground with the other person so that you can build a rapport with them. You want to see what kinds of hobbies and values and interests that they have and that you have in common with them, so that you can riff on that and build up a relationship based on that. And most of all, people love to talk about their interests and passions, as makes sense, right? Asking what are you passionate about can get some really cool responses, because once they feel comfortable to talk about it, people just light up when they talk about what they love. This is where you learn the most about a person, and listening to their answers can fill you with a kind of joy, and encouraging their excitement shows that you care about them. So, I mean, I always find it the most satisfying when the person I'm talking to is talking about something that they're just passionate about, and you can see the spark in their eyes, and they start, gesticulating a lot more and just getting really into it, and then they're excited and you're excited, and that's a great way to build a fantastic connection. Lynn, do you have anything to add about asking the right questions to encourage conversation?
Yeah, and I'm going to build on. So if you're at a work event, or some kind of other type of situation, even if it's a personal family reunion, there are other things that you can ask, even if you start with, what do you do, right? It could be, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And then, or if you weren't here and you could be doing anything at all, what would that be? And that's a way to sort of get some interests or passions out of them, and sort of have them sort of think like, wow, okay, and they start to reach for the answer. And then from those responses, you can keep the dialogue going, and it's just going to, additional questions are going to naturally evolve. I think it's another thing that, besides knowing the right questions, you have to remember that you don't need the answers. It's just important to listen. And if they ask, or you're prompted, definitely make suggestions or brainstorm some ideas with them. Some people, and myself, absolutely, I need to vent verbally. And so that's important, that, I have, my network who will let me just get it off my chest, right? But I'm not actually necessarily looking for an answer or a solution or for someone to fix it. I just want to talk about it. So those are all things that to be mindful of when when you're working on these questions. Amanda, what do you think?
Well, Lynn and Rachel, you both had some great ideas and suggestions. Some people are really shy and they're not that forthcoming, especially at first, but that doesn't mean they don't have interesting things to say. that's why it's so important to get them talking by asking them these questions, find out their passions, and make them feel comfortable enough to actually talk about them. And like Rachel was saying, that will really foster a great connection and make them feel like what they have to say and what their interests are valuable, and that you're forging that good connection. And if you're talking to someone that you might know better, and if you've been listening well, you'll have a good idea of what their interests and passions are already. And when you talk to them, you can ask them about that. Ask them every time you see them, hey, how is your interest in Pokemon Go, which happens to be an interest of two close relatives of mine. Ask them about that. Even if you personally are not that interested in Pokemon Go, you understand that they are, and you value what they're interested in. And that will give them a chance to talk about things they love and develop a stronger relationship with you. And you can also ask them about things you do have in common, though. Perhaps you both have an interest in the same band, or you both like gardening. Talk about that, and that will keep you both engaged in a positive conversation. So this takes us to our next point, which is talking and being heard. So the first step to being an appreciated speaker is your level of topical awareness. Whoever you're talking to, make sure you know your audience. Be aware of how much they know about a topic, how interested they are in it, and how much detail you should go into when discussing it. Keep in mind what is appropriate depending on the audience. You don't want to say anything offensive or inaccurate. So Rachel and Lynn, how does the audience you're speaking with affect what you talk about or how you talk about it? Rachel, you like to answer first?
No, sure. I mean, to be fair, I don't think I'm necessarily the best person to be asking this question, because if anything, I'm an oversharer, and I kind of learned the hard way about what I shouldn't talk about to certain people. So maybe ask me in a few years and I'll have a better answer for you. But Lynn might have a little more wisdom here.
Well, it definitely depends upon your degree of your relationship with them and your connection. It also depends on the setting. So if you're one-on-one with someone that you're very close with, you can ask more personal questions or engage in a more personal dialogue. However, if there are other cases with the same person, you could be at a public venue, you could be standing in line at Starbucks, and you don't want to start some kind of very personal conversation that can be overheard, because it could make the other person uncomfortable. And you don't need to be the latest show at the coffee stand, right? So it's definitely a combination of the individual and your relationship with them and the setting, and those are the things that I think that you really need to consider. And to everyone's point, you don't want to do anything that's going to make them uncomfortable, or put them in a tight spot that makes them, once again, it's not just feeling uncomfortable, but they may actually make them angry that you're asking about this in this setting.
Yeah, those are great points, Lynn. When talking to family and friends, you can usually be much more relaxed than you would be in a professional setting, and you probably know each other rather well, and therefore should have a good idea of what their interests are, what their knowledge is, and what kind of things they would be comfortable talking about. You already have a lot of things in common, and especially experiences together. But in a professional setting, you'll want to be more formal and probably keep personal matters to a minimum. As you were mentioning, you wouldn't necessarily get into certain conversations with someone at Starbucks. You also wouldn't get into certain conversations, say, with your boss at the office. But what you should do when you're talking to these other people is focus on your common goals as an organization or as a group. Regardless of who you're talking to, be conscious of how much time you're spending talking as well. Don't talk too much or for too long. People are busy and others will likely want to speak up too. They may start to tune you out if you go on and on about something. So say what you need to say, then give your partner or audience a chance to respond. To make sure you do this, try to interact with whomever you're speaking with. As we said in the previous slide, ask them questions. Keep their attention by making sure they're part of the conversation, not just a passive listener. And as Lynn already mentioned, this will all vary depending on who you're talking to and the size of your audience. Are you talking to 1 or 2 people, a group of 10? Unless you're giving a presentation, try to keep the proportions pretty fair. Don't talk more than everyone else. What you do say should be valuable and to the point. Rachel, what would you like to add about knowing your audience?
I think a good idea, and something that you sort of alluded to there, Amanda, is to ask questions as a follow-up to what you're saying. Even just saying, like, you know what I mean, can open up the conversation for others to participate and lets them know that you do care that they're there. You're not just talking to them because they happen to be a warm body that's in front of you, right? You actually care what they think. And it's also important, as you mentioned, to keep your topics in check. If it's something that interests you, but not the other present, you might want to keep that in mind, or you definitely want to keep that in mind. If they're close friends, they'll probably care enough about you to listen to you for a little while because they know that is a thing you're passionate about. We've talked about grandma and her genealogy, but even me talking to you, Amanda, I have a very big interest in the K-pop band Big Bang, and I know that you don't. So if something particularly interesting happens, or I come up with a very, I don't know, deep idea about something that they've done or their songs, I can tell you about it, and I know that you're willing to listen for a little bit. I try not to go on for more than a couple of minutes, though. And so when you're talking to something you're passionate about, even to someone that you're pretty close with, you still want to keep in mind not to keep going on for too long because you'll end up boring them. And some people are not afraid to call you out when you're boring them, and that can kind of hurt your feelings. Lynn, what would you add to knowing your audience?
Oh, I'm going to give a shout out to our book, Practical Wisdoms at Work, because Chapter 8 discusses this exact topic, in the workplace. And so I would definitely recommend that's a quick read. But
actually, before you continue on there, sorry, I know we mentioned not interrupting, but also in that book, there's a story about me not knowing my audience and telling a very personal story to my boss and how that created an awkward situation. So
that's right.
You'll find a couple of examples there.
Yeah, the book is filled with these personal vignettes that really help you connect with what we're saying, right? So, and it's no problem interrupting. That was great, Rachel, to add that in. I think that the whole point here is understanding the motivations and your relationship with your audience. And that is such an important life skill. It's also a really critical leadership skill for you at work. And recognizing the boundaries and then how to flex within those parameters, honestly, that would make another great segment for us to cover in the future, right? At least I think so.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot to talk about there.
So, and that's a great segue to speak like a pro. So when it's your turn to do the speaking. And, one of the things is to be on the same page as your audience. I mean, it's so vital to listen, to contribute, to visualize sort of the portent or the effect of your discussion. So in some cases, it could even be the ramifications of your discussion when it's a really serious discussion. So, thinking before you speak is always important, and using that powerful pause to do that. So with close friends and family, you do have really enormous latitude. But these things are still going to help you when you respond to them rather than reacting. Because your friends or family could say or share something that either surprises you or concerns you. And one thing to think about, so using this think before you speak and this powerful pause, is that you can respond by saying, let me take a moment to process this. You can also reach out and touch their hand or their shoulder, sort of that physical connection to someone you're close with, because that shows that you care. And once again, it's allowing you that moment to think before you speak and to use that pause so that you can formulate your thoughts. And that really can be so helpful for you. Amanda and Rachel, do you have suggestions on how to handle these types of situations?
Well, for me, I think it's important just to be genuine and be supportive. Sometimes it can be hard to know how you should react or how you can make someone feel better. But the best thing you can do is be honest and be kind. Rachel, what about you?
Well, what I'm thinking a lot about here is when someone tells you a piece of pretty bad news, right? And in that situation, I think that the simplest and best response is just to say exactly what you mean. So after my dad died, I got some responses that I appreciated, but I didn't really connect with them. Ideas like, or statements like, "Oh, he's in a better place," or other things that were kind of meant to cheer me up, but they just didn't, because I mean a lot of that was speaking into something that I just don't believe in, right? But it was also just like I didn't feel like they were taking it gravely enough, if that makes sense. I much preferred a friend who, when I told them that my dad had recently died, they just quite honestly said, "Wow, that sucks." And for me, I was just like, yeah, it does. Thank you for actually just saying it as it is. So being candid can really be very powerful. And I know that Lynn mentioned reaching out and touching a person's hand or their shoulder, which can definitely be a powerful move to build an emotional connection. But you also need to be mindful of that person's boundaries and your own boundaries. So you don't want to do something that they're not comfortable with or that you're not comfortable with, which of course Lynn and everyone here I think is aware of. But yeah, those are my tips, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be the right relationship in the setting, to do that. So, and always be respectful of someone else's personal space. So, I'm going to continue on this theme of the powerful pause, because it is so effective to allow you to refocus also the other person's attention. Because when they hear you use a pause, it can be very deliberate, so that you can then say something important. So use those powerful pauses. Another point that, you may think this is really general, but it's sort of stop apologizing. And I am not saying to stop apologizing for something that's absolutely genuine that you need to apologize for. Okay, that's not it. What I am saying is that it's a common characteristic of women to over apologize, to apologize for things that are just, honestly, they're silly, they're not necessary, and it diminishes our power, especially in a work setting, but also in an interpersonal relationships. you know and it's things like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have dinner ready on time. I mean, hello, we have a life, everyone's got a bunch of things going on. There's a lot of these types of things, and maybe that's not right depending on the situation, but that's what I'm trying to get at here. This tendency to apologize for all these little things that are unnecessary. Rachel and Amanda, what would you like to add about the over apologizing?
Well, you're right, Lynn. Of course, you do want to apologize for being rude or doing something genuinely wrong, but you should also definitely be mindful of when sorry comes out of your mouth and ask yourself if you're really sorry. Because I feel like when you say sorry too often about things that you're not sorry about, it sort of translates to the person that you're speaking to that you're sorry doesn't actually mean that you're
Yep.
sorry.
Yep.
So you're sort of cheapening that word for yourself. So when you do actually apologize, it can be a little less powerful, or you'll have to work so much harder to genuinely express that you are sorry for what you just did or said. In general, though, when you've done something maybe mildly kind of wrong or sort of inconveniencing, it's better to say thank you. Like, thank you for understanding, or thank you for letting me get off that chest, or letting me get that off my chest, or
unless you were standing on a chest,
those kinds of things.
Sorry.
Yeah. In that case, do apologize for doing that, unless they wanted you to for some reason. So but like, understand, just always ask yourself why you're saying it and whether you're actually sorry. Amanda, what would you add?
Well, Rachel, those are great points. I would say don't apologize for speaking up or for not knowing the right answer, and don't apologize for existing. So don't say sorry every time you do anything that's even slightly inconvenienced or delay someone. Just say thank you, or be gracious. You have to be confident in yourself and what you're saying, or try to appear confident and be gracious of others' attention and time.
Yeah, that's amazing. Perfect. And I think that we've been talking about oversharing, and we've talked about that a lot, so I'm not going to keep oversharing on oversharing. But I am going to say we do want to be present in the conversation, and that your energy is really focused on the other person or the people in the conversation and the dialogue that you're having. And how you demonstrate your attention or enthusiasm is linked to the discussion at hand. You know, the tone and the context are so important when to speak like a pro. So, Rachel and Amanda, how do you adjust your style to fit the tone of the conversation? Rachel?
I mean, I think another important skill to learn is how to read the room. So don't be funny when the mood is somber. Be negative when people are happy. I mean, that's not to say like you can't try to lighten the mood and you can't try to make a good point about something that could go wrong. But overall, like you don't want to just come out of left field and be jarring, right? I'm not asking you to change who you are, but the idea is to be appropriate for the situation. So, I mean, we talked about my grief for my dad earlier, right? And how a very glib "that sucks" response was actually most appreciated. But other times, I wanted to like really talk about it, and that would mean that the person would need to respond differently. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine today about her grief for a lost family member, and I was able to connect in that way, right? So it's just understanding like what the person you're talking to needs and also what you need yourself.
Yeah, again, this is about knowing your audience, and you have to pay attention to how other people are reacting to your words. Are they actively engaged? Or do they look like they're losing interest? Do they look offended? Do they look pleased by what you're saying? And act accordingly. Some other tips I have are, we already touched on this before, but don't drone on about things that others aren't interested in. As we mentioned, it's okay if you're super enthusiastic about something, and depending on who you're talking to, you can talk about it for a little while, and they'll likely be encouraging of that. They'll appreciate that you're talking to them about this subject. But remember that if you know that they're not interested in the subject, you don't need to go on and on about it. You might have another person that you can talk to instead about this. So perhaps your best friend isn't interested in this one thing, but maybe your brother is, and you can choose to talk to him about it more so than you talk to your friend about it. Most people won't be rude or start obviously ignoring you, but it's good to be considerate of their interest and their time. Another idea to make sure you're heard is to be an engaging speaker. You don't want to be monotone or boring. People will have a hard time paying attention if you are. So I have a brief story about that. One time I had a class when I was in college, and it was a political science class, which was not my major, but it looked like an interesting subject, and so I took a class in it. But unfortunately, it was kind of a negative experience for me because the lecturer, my political science teacher, he had a very monotone way of talking. He sounded bored by what he was saying, and he sounded like he was going to fall asleep at any given moment. And that made it so hard for me to really pay attention to what he was teaching to us and what he was saying in the class.
Yeah.
And it was difficult because it was after lunchtime, and at that point it was like my last class of the day, and it felt like he was just trying to lull me to sleep, and it was hard to really absorb what I was supposed to be learning in the class.
Yeah. He needed some energy.
Yeah, he certainly did. So I feel like I would have gotten a lot more out of the class if he'd been a much more engaging or enthusiastic or interesting speaker in some way. So vocal inflections can be good, and hand movements can be good. And that's in contrast to another teacher I had who was very excited about his subject. And that was an 8:30 a.m. class, and I was super tired at that point too, but his enthusiasm kind of kept my eyes open and kept me engaged because he was so happy about what he was talking about. So
yeah, that
Rachel,
can make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rachel, do you have any final tips to add?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we keep talking about, keeping your proportions right, or not speaking too much, not dominating conversations, but also like don't speak too little. We're not saying that you need to keep a timer on how long each person is talking in this conversation. We're just asking that you be sort of aware of what's going on. It's meant to make sure that you're not monologuing, but you're not just being like, you're not just listening either, that you have something to contribute, and also to make sure that you're not just being like, they're not just talking to you because you're just there, right? And because as we've said earlier, conversations are meant to be a forum for you to connect, and it's not meant to be an emotional dumping ground for you. Although sometimes, as I think Lynn earlier mentioned, that sometimes she needs to vent verbally. I'm exactly the same way. And so sometimes you do need a conversation to be an emotional dumping ground. And if that's what you need, that's fine. But you just need to ask someone probably close to you, if you can, vent to them and let them know, hey, I need to get something off of my chest. I just need to talk something out. Is that okay? And then they'll understand what this conversation is going to be. So keep that in mind. And just always be respectful of other people and their time. And I think that's how you're going to be a great conversationalist.
Yeah, I agree. And I definitely like your point there at the end, Rachel, that always letting someone know that you need to get something off your chest, or you need to just talk something through, so that they can, do they have the time and the energy at that point to let you vent, is really important. All right. So thank you. Thank you to all our members and guests who joined us for this installment of the Growth in Life Virtual Mentoring Series. And, thank you so much for being part of the dialogue here at Petite to Queen. If you have a question or would like to suggest topics for discussion, please email us at jointheconversation@petitetoqueen.com.